There we go. Perfect. So that's that started. So the first wee thing that we're going to just discuss today is just a little bit about what is accessibility and why is it important. So the kind of first thing that we'll just go over. Oh, sorry, I've got two different things open here. So the first thing that I'll go. Oh no, there we go. First wee thing that I'll just go over is just basically what is web accessibility. So web accessibility refers to the inclusive practice of removing barriers that prevent interaction with or access to websites and apps by people with disabilities. So we need to talk about how a person's disability affects the way they process information on a page and how they interact with and between pages. So providing accessible products and services is a great enabler and source of freedom for people with disabilities. So if someone that maybe uses a keyboard, which we'll go into in a wee bit more detail in a moment, but if someone maybe needs to use a keyboard to access, say, a banking app or online shopping, but the website isn't keyboard accessible, it can be quite frustrating for them if they need to then maybe ask a family member or a friend for help, and it just completely removes their autonomy as well. So it's just so important that we create these accessible products, because an inaccessible service locks people out. And it's just so important that if we implement web accessibility, because it's essential for equal opportunity, just for, as I say, not even just for doing day-to-day things like online shopping, but also for things like applying for jobs or even just doing their job or whatever it may be. So the next wee thing I just want to quickly talk about is just sort of accessibility drivers. So this is something that I discuss with a lot of clients that I speak to every day, on how they can get sort of the higher ups, the CEOs and stakeholders and everything like that engaged with accessibility, and how they can get them to see it as important. So the kind of first two that I'm just going to sort of lump together are the business case and the sales case for accessibility. So a company should understand that being inclusive is good for their business. It make people like to know that the product or service they're using is accessible for everyone, and then they can actually go out and they almost have a sense of pride. It's, oh, I use that, and that's meant to be accessible for people. So that gets just everyone in, but it also increases sales in terms of the people that can actually use your product or service. Because if you've got an accessible product or service, people that do use a keyboard or a screen reader or maybe have other forms of visual impairment or whatever it may be can actually come to your product or service and use it like everyone else can. So one thing that I like to always mention is the spending power of kind of disabled people and their families is 249 billion a year. So that's referred to as the purple pound. So if your product or service isn't accessible, you're then missing out on this demographic, and you're missing out on that huge amount of money that could be coming into your business. And then they'll just go elsewhere, and they'll go to a product or service, maybe a rival that's actually is accessible. So the next one is just on the sort of legislation and regulations that are involved. So this is something that I'm going to talk about in a wee bit more detail later on. But basically, there's a lot of legislation and regulations around accessibility. And if, say, you're not being accessible, you could face lawsuits, you could incur fines, you could even be blocked from trading in certain areas, which is something that I will, as I say, I'll be discussing kind of later on. And the next one is just about personal connection. So sometimes to get people on board with accessibility is to get them thinking about maybe someone in their family that has a disability. So it could be maybe a niece or a nephew or a cousin or whatever it may be, but it could also be kind of friends and things like that, that if you get them thinking about how these people would interact with their product or service, they might be then more inclined to go, okay, we need to actually really think about accessibility and think why it's so important. And kind of the next one is on competitor advantage. So this is something that I kind of discussed with the business case and the sales case, but that's if your product or service is accessible, you're going to get a large proportion of people that are able to then use your product or service. And there's a lot of word of mouth among certain communities, specifically maybe like the visually impaired community. They talk a lot about kind of products and services that are accessible, and then they can tell their friends or family or whoever it may be, who then will come to your website and go, oh yeah, that's accessible, let's use that. So it's, and then finally, the one that is most important to, should be the main thing and the only thing really, is just the moral right of it. So accessibility should just be built into everything we do. I think as human beings, we should be helping everyone just have a equal playing field where possible, and just thinking about everyone equally instead of thinking about money or possible fines or whatever it may be. But unfortunately, from my experience, that isn't always the case. So it's something to, but hopefully everyone here realizes that it's just a moral right as opposed to thinking about all these other ones. But if you're maybe talking to a manager or whatever it may be, it's sometimes important to think about these other ones as well. So the next wee thing I want to quickly talk about is sort of more of my day-to-day. So when I'm doing audits of websites, when I'm going through testing with keyboard and screen reader and everything like that, I'm thinking about the web content accessibility guidelines. So when the web content accessibility guidelines are basically the de facto standard kind of worldwide for testing accessibility. And they're also most commonly known as just WCAG. So if I say WCAG, I'm referring to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So it's something that I would encourage you to go have a wee look at if you haven't already. Basically, it's almost like a big checklist of things that you should be looking at and comparing your website against to ensure that it can reach the biggest possible audience. So one of the main things recently actually changed my work quite a lot recently was the latest version of turning to WCAG 2.2. I believe it was in just the end of last year it came out, and it sort of added a lot of new criteria. It changed existing criteria, removed some. So if you know WCAG 2.1, I would really encourage you to go out of your way and read WCAG 2.2 as well. And just on that, just when I say the de facto standard as well, it's something I'm going to touch on in a wee bit as well, but and a lot of the accessibility legislation is based on WCAG as well. So if you want your product or service to legally meet legal requirements, the best way to do that is just to have a think about WCAG and trying to meet all the AA criteria, but I'm going to touch on that in a second. So there are four main principles when it comes to WCAG. So I'll be touching on these in a wee bit as well, but the four main principles are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So but I'll go into a wee bit more detail on what that is in a wee moment. So there's 86 criteria in WCAG, so there's quite a lot, and a lot of the criteria are quite difficult to actually understand and read and everything like that. So if you are going to be delving into WCAG, I would really encourage you to maybe just take it a few at a time and just try and fully understand them as best as you can. So a wee second ago, I mentioned the WCAG AA. So when it comes to WCAG, there's A, AA, and AAA, and most of the requirements are to just AA. So there's 55 criteria to meet if you want to meet level AA. So if you want to meet AA, you have to meet all the level A criteria and all the AA criteria. So it's quite a large body of work if you want to achieve that. And then when it comes to AAA, that's sort of even more difficult to reach. And the reason the criteria just goes for AA is because AAA is so difficult to achieve. So it's probably something that I wouldn't really think about unless you want to go above and beyond. Maybe just look at a few criteria and see kind of what your thoughts on that are. So I mentioned about the kind of four principles. So they're POUR, so perceivable. Do I know something exists? So this refers to a grouping of criteria that basically allows all users to understand and perceive what is on screen. So that can be things like alt text for images, it can be transcripts for video content or audible content, and just making sure that everyone is able to understand what is on the page, and that can also be um, just for icons and things like that, making sure that when a screen reader lands on that, they're able to actually fully understand what that is as well. And the next wee thing is, the next one is operable. So can I interact with it? So if you've only ever used a mouse, I would really encourage you to try and navigate just any website using the keyboard. So a keyboard user will navigate the site by pressing the tab key, and then they will go through all the interactive elements on the site, and then they can press enter or space to interact with those elements. However, in a lot of the websites that I test on a day-to-day basis, these don't always work. So it's about making sure that all users, regardless of if they're using a mouse, a keyboard, voice controls, whatever it may be, are able to actually operate your website. And the next one is understandable. So just making sure that the content and user interface is understandable. So a lot of the time that refers to just making forms and things like that easy to understand, and make sure that it helps users. Oh, sorry, I forgot. I've not actually changed the page. Excuse me. Sorry. So yeah, so understandable. So this refers to just making sure that forms and things like that are designed in a way that it helps users not make mistakes. So it's not overly complex, it's predictable, they can understand what's going to happen on the page, and make sure that content isn't written in kind of overcomplicated language as well, as that can just block a lot of users, maybe people that English is their second language, or maybe just struggle a wee bit with the written word as well. Just making sure that it just makes sense for everyone where possible. And the last one is just robust. So this refers to making sure that the content or the code is actually as clean as possible. So using HTML to specification, so using buttons, button elements, instead of just making a div and doing whatever it may be in there and just making it complicated. So just using clean code and making sure that everything has the correct roles and names. Like I say, just links should be links, buttons should be buttons, everything like that. So the next wee thing I'm just going to talk about is just, as I mentioned, the legislation that's involved. So 2 seconds. Excuse me. So as I say, I'm going to just talk briefly about the legislation, because there's only a few things that you need to really understand, and that is basically just making the product accessible. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is just the Equality Act 2010. So I'm going to talk briefly about that, and then talk about public sector bodies accessibility regulation. So basically, the Equality Act 2010 is just anti-discrimination legislation for the UK, and includes all of society and not just people with disabilities. And probably if you've, depending how long you've been in the workforce for, you've probably heard the term reasonable adjustment. So that just refers to making reasonable adjustments for all employees, not just if someone's got a disability or not. But the main one that I work with basically every day is the public sector bodies accessibility regulation of 2018. Massive word, massive tongue twister, that one, when you want to say it fast. But basically, it refers to the legal requirement for public sector websites to be AA compliant. So when the work I've done with certain public sector bodies, we have to, if they fail a single WCAG AA criteria, or as I say, AA or single A, they need to fix that right away, as it's a legal requirement. So that's one of the main things. So if you happen to, in the future, be working for a public sector, or currently do, it's something to definitely keep in mind if you don't already know about it. Um, And the next one is just the legislation that's in the EU. So this is the European Accessibility Act. So basically, it ensures consistent accessibility rules across EU member states. So the idea is that this has been implemented just so that there's the consistency. And because at the moment, between different member states, there's all different laws and regulations around it. So it's just to make it as easy as possible for everyone just knows where they stand, and it applies just to a broad range of products and services from phones, mobiles, TV equipment, banking services, ebooks, e-commerce, all of these kind of things. And unlike the public sector body's accessibility regulation, it refers not just to public sectors, but also just basically everyone that wants to trade in the EU. So the reason I bring this up is, although the UK isn't part of the EU anymore, anyone that wants to trade in the EU needs to make their product and service accessible. And if they don't, they can actually incur fines, or even being blocked from trading altogether. So as I say, if you work for anyone that maybe trades in the EU, you have until 2025, which is the deadline. So I would maybe brush up on your accessibility if you haven't done so already. So, and there's also other regulations like the Americans with Disabilities Act and things like that, but we won't go into those today. But would encourage you to have a wee look at these, and if you have time as well, that would be something that would be probably a lot for you you would get a lot out of that as well. So the next wee thing is I'm going to just pass over to Anita, who's going to impart her knowledge on accessible design. Is that okay, Anita?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So this is Anita, and I'm happy to join Kieran. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Within the accessibility scope, there's a number of different folks that have a variety of expertise at different points along the way. So I'm very excited that Kieran has invited me to join in. Because with product design, I'm an accessibility design partner and I work within the user experience team. So right from the beginning, when a new website or a mobile app is even from concept and forward, even if you're just having ideas about it, if accessibility is thought of at the very beginning within your inclusive design team or service design or even user-centered design, there's many different names for that, like human-centered, then that is an amazing place to start. And it's highly recommended to start with accessibility at the very beginning, because it makes sense in a lot of ways. If it's designed with accessibility from the beginning, then of course it will be coded to be accessible because we partner with developers. And then if the developers are doing accessible code, then by the time it reaches Kieran as an analyst, it's going to be, in a much better place and probably have a lot fewer issues or things that need to be fixed because accessibility was considered from the beginning. So I like to describe what I do as reducing the friction and increasing the flow of usability of digital content in partnership with the disability community. And that's very important that persons with lived experience and that are using assistive technology tools and adaptive strategies are included, and active, that's gold standard, active participants, active within research, actually, as our colleagues, absolutely with lived experience through all these different types of scenarios. And I like to use the analogy about a brand new building. When you construct a new building, you need an entire team. You have an architect that actually plans and it says, hey, we're going to make this building accessible to everyone, make it easy to navigate, make sure there's exits that are safe, and all the things that an architect would do. Then you have the actual builder that comes in and builds the building, and then you have an inspector at the end that says, hey, all of the beams are holding everything up, everything looks great, your inspection is passed. So the reason I like to use that is because with an accessibility designer, we're actually the architects. We are part of the planning process to say this is how we're looking at WCAG, those guidelines in which to design everything on your website and your app. And then we do annotations within the user experience section of the product lifecycle and hand that off to the accessibility developers, which are the builders. They're building the code of your website and your mobile app. So we are partnering very closely with your builders. And then the inspectors, again, that would be your accessibility analysts, your accessibility engineers. There's another title, they may do some testing as well. But you're in such an amazing space at that point, by the time it gets to your inspector, where the inspector says, hey, this is looking good, this is great, your building is safe, it's usable, and it's welcoming for everyone. So I hope that little analogy makes sense. So for example, if design is left completely out of it, and then there's no sort of direction or guidance for the developers to do accessible code, and if accessibility isn't a complete afterthought or not considered at all, then you do have accessibility analysts that come in and have to point out, well, this does not meet the guidelines. This is a failure. This is not usable. So I like to also make a point that accessibility, a lot of times that term is not really understood, what we mean exactly by accessibility. And I like to say it's synonymous with usability. So if you have a form that is not built to accessibility, it's not usable for different folks that are interacting with your content. So maybe that's a little bit easier to understand. It's about usability. And if it doesn't serve everyone, then it's a fail. It doesn't, we need to welcome everyone. So again, the last point, just websites and mobile apps must be designed, developed, and tested for accessibility throughout the product life cycle. And I'm very excited. Kieran's going to go more into detail about all the things, but just as you're going through that level of detail as a designer, these are the things we're looking for and trying to make sure are up to these guidelines right from the beginning. So thank you, Kieran.
Perfect. Will we just get started on the next wee bit? Mm-hmm. Perfect. 2 seconds. Cool. So the next wee thing that I just want to kind of talk about today is just kind of understanding disabled people. So I think when people think about disability, they think about certain things, maybe someone in a wheelchair, or someone maybe with a seeing eye dog, or whatever it may be, or something along those kind of lines. However, accessibility is just a spectrum. It can refer to all different kinds of people and different disabilities. So one of the kind of main things that we always talk about in accessibility is basically that accessibility is for everyone. So accessibility is not just designed for a minority, but accessible services actually benefit everyone. So one way to think about it is just the idea of the different types of disabilities. So here we've got an example of sort of permanent disabilities, something that will not change over time. So maybe the example here is someone that's kind of missing an arm, and a temporary disability, which is someone that's got their arm in a sling. So this is something that will get better over time once the arm heals. And we've got situational disabilities. So things that are caused by a situation or the context they're in. So maybe holding a baby. So these all impact how we interact with, say, our phones or the computer or whatever it may be. So an example could be low contrast text. So that affects someone that maybe has a visual impairment. Maybe they struggle to see text when it's maybe like a light grey against a dark grey or whatever it may be. But that also affects people that have temporary disabilities. So someone that maybe just came out of cataract eye surgery, and they maybe are struggling to see things for a wee while until the surgery is healed. But you've also got situational disabilities. So you've got maybe not that it happens very often in Scotland, but if you're out on a sunny day and you might struggle to see text because of the glare. So it's just so important that everyone understands that when we think about disability, it's not just going to help maybe a minority of people that people seem to think of, but it just helps everyone. And if we make everything as accessible as possible, it's going to be a lot easier for just everyone to use. So one way that was really interesting for me was when I started in this career was looking at the Microsoft Inclusive Design Toolkit. So it goes into a lot more detail of this idea of accessibility being for everyone and these temporary situational disabilities. And so here we've got a wee screenshot from that. So it goes over how some disabilities for touch, such as we mentioned, one arm disability, or a new parent, but also hearing, permanent, temporary, and situational disability. So things, maybe someone's deaf, temporary, they might have an ear infection, or they could just be a bartender or someone else that is in a really loud environment. So having captions and subtitles and things like that just helps all these user groups, regardless of if their disability is permanent, temporary, or situational. And there is also here we've got examples for people seeing as well, which we've kind of mentioned, and kind of people that have different things affecting their speech as well. So, oops, there we go, down another one. Perfect. So the next wee thing I just want to kind of talk about is how we can categorize such a wide range of such a large spectrum of disabilities and different people. So here I've got a cloud of kind of loads and loads and loads of different, a myriad of different disabilities and things like that. So we've got things like cognitive, hearing, blindness, deafness, low vision, motor, all these kind of things. So with such a large spectrum of different disabilities, the way that we tend to think about it is in terms of breaking them down into just 4 distinct groups. So that's visual for people that maybe are blind, low vision, color blindness, auditory impairments such as deafness, hard of hearing, motor impairments, maybe someone that has a tremor or inability to use a mouse or limited motor control, but also, and it also breaks it down into kind of cognitive disabilities as well. So maybe any learning disabilities or dyslexia, distractibility like ADHD and things like that. And this is another thing that I like to bring up to clients as well, is just that 1 in 5 people in the UK have a disability. So it's, again, as I mentioned before, it's such a large demographic of people that if we don't think about all these different groups and how they would interact with our websites or our apps or whatever it may be, you can be missing out on such a huge demographic of people. And I've also mentioned, I've got here as well about the purple pound that we mentioned earlier, just the 274 billion per year. That's the spending power of disabled people and their families. So it's, again, something to keep in mind. So so I've mentioned the sort of 4 categories. So I'm going to go into a wee bit more detail on that and kind of talk briefly about how each of them would maybe interact with websites and different kind of hints and tips to try and that you can implement every day, or when building products and services. So the first one is just on visual impairment. So I'll just start with a few stats that, again, I use with clients every day. So the first one is just that 2 million people in the UK have significant sight loss. So as I mentioned before, that's such a huge demographic of people. So if they're not able to actually interact with your product and service, you're going to really struggle. So one way that these demographics or the people with visual impairments might interact with your website is by using things like a screen reader. So I don't know how many of you have kind of tested out a screen reader, but I would really encourage you to kind of do so, just to try and understand how people would do interact with products and services. So basically, what a screen reader is just a way for maybe a blind user to actually interact with websites by having it announce what is on the page, both for interactive elements and to read out text. So one thing that what we do a lot is just using the tab key to move through interactive elements, so going to links and buttons and things like that. So, but that's something that I would really encourage you to try out in your own time. So just a couple of wee kind of tips for how you can improve the screen reader experience for these people is just making sure that you're using headings appropriately. So using kind of like a H1, and then you've got a H2, and then inside that you've got maybe H3s and 4s just for sort of subsections and everything like that. So just using them to specifications, because a big way that screen reader users and keyboard users navigate a page and understand its structure is actually by navigating via these headings. So would really encourage you not to just use a H1 halfway through the page just for styling purposes, but actually use these heading elements appropriately, and just make sure that the headings have appropriate text on them as well. So it's not, I was doing an audit recently that basically they didn't think about headings at all, and they just put whole blocks of text in a heading. So it just doesn't explain what the purpose of that heading is to a screen reader user who might otherwise struggle to navigate a page. And the next wee thing is that they also use things like the browser zoom on your computer, or screen magnification software. So the screen magnification software is, if you imagine literally just holding a magnifier and going over the page, so it allows them to zoom in. But one of the other ways is to actually use the browser zoom on your computer. So actually zooming in, but a lot of the time the problem with that is a lot of information can sometimes be lost off the page, and it can be difficult to navigate. So one little tip on that is just to make sure that you use responsive design correctly. So using percentages and M's instead of using pixels or whatever it may be for these elements. So just kind of keep that in mind as well. So just another couple wee things to kind of consider, as I kind of mentioned before, is just thinking about color contrast. So we've got an example here on the right from one of the websites that we worked with. So it's a grey on a grey background, and has a color contrast ratio of 2.8 to 1. So as I said, that can be really difficult for all users to actually, I mean, even with someone that supposedly has 20/20 vision, struggles to see that. So it's just important to think about that as well. And the next wee thing is the focus indicator. So as if you've never used the tab key to move around the page, we've got an example here of a focus indicator of on the Beyonce website. So basically it's that little halo around the parfum link. So that halo, that's a wee joke for the Beyonce fans out there, by the way. So basically, if you're a keyboard user who also has a visual impairment, you might struggle to actually see that the little outline or the focus indicator. So it's about making sure that that is easy to perceive as well. So making sure it has adequate contrast ratio from the background as well. And just also make sure that images have appropriate alt text. So here we've got a sort of bad example here. So the alt text is
Kieran, sorry. I think the slide we just stuck on visual impairment. Sorry, I think.
There we go.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry about that. Sorry about that. So the problem is I've got it open twice on two different screens. So I apologize for that. Yeah, so sorry. So where was I? Yes. So down the bottom here, we've got some alt text for this image here. So probably you would all realize that yellow button doesn't really tell you what this element is. So we need to think about how to use alt text appropriately. So I've got loads of resources at the end for kind of how to implement alt text correctly. So it's just about thinking what the image is for if it's decorative, if it's maybe a link, just making sure that we let users know what the purpose of the image is. And as I mentioned before, mentioned a bit about browser zoom before, but just make sure that you test with browser zoom applied on websites that maybe you're developing or testing or whatever it may be, just to make sure that content isn't lost off the screen. So in this example, you can see that certain text is actually going off the screen and can't be accessed at all. So people with low vision that use browser zoom, it's really beneficial for these user groups. And the next thing I'm just going to touch on quickly is just about auditory impairment. So to use the web effectively, people who are deaf or partially deaf really rely on things like transcripts or captions for video and audible content. So one thing to keep in mind for that is that on YouTube and all these other kind of things, they've got auto-generated captions. However, you've probably seen yourself that they aren't very accurate. So especially if the person's got a Scottish accent, it really struggles. So it's just about making sure that if you are releasing content that does have transcripts or captions, just make sure that they are accurate and accurately represent what the person is saying or doing and all these kind of things as well. And just make sure that also that video content, you have the ability to pause and rewind and adjust the volume of content as well, just for these user groups, as sometimes they might have a hearing aid in and they might need to put their hearing, I know from my experience with my grand, she never has her hearing aids in, so needs to put them back in and everything like that. So they might need to rewind and start from the beginning after they've turned their hearing aid on. So it's just so important to think about that as well. And the last wee thing is just about making sure content is in plain English, because an interesting fact is that a lot of British Sign Language users, their second language is actually sometimes English. So it's just about, they might have difficulty actually interacting with the content on the page if it's overly complex. So the next wee thing, this is just a good example from the Scottish Parliament website, is just an example of a BSL interpreter for content that they have on the page. So yeah, this isn't like a necessary, but it's a really good to have if you have the resources and time to do so. The next wee thing I'm just going to talk about as well is just sort of mobility impairments and how these user groups would interact with the page. So they might use, as I say, use the keyboard to navigate, and that could be an ergonomic or specially designed keyboard or mouse, or on-screen keyboards with trackballs or other pointer devices. It could be a head pointer or a mouth stick or other aid to help with typing. So we'll show a wee example of that in a second. And there's also voice recognition, eye tracking, all these kind of things. So there's such a broad range of equipment that people use. And it's just about making sure that these users can actually interact with the page. So on this next page here, we've got an example of some ergonomic mice. Can never remember which one it is. But we've also got, in the middle here, we've got someone using a mouth stick. And so they're using a physical keyboard in front of them to actually interact, maybe because they've got a mobility impairment that maybe stops them using their arms or whatever it may be. And we've also got an example of some pedals here. So they can, users that maybe don't have full mobility in their arms can actually also use foot pedals to tab through the website, just kind of go through back and forth using that. There's also one down here, we've got some accessible controllers, which is something close to my heart as someone that is a big gamer. It's great to see that everyone would be able to use, you play their favorite games. And lastly, we've got, this is an example of a head pointer that someone would use. So a little tip on that is just to make sure that if like elements on the page, such as buttons and links, have adequate target size. As you can imagine, someone that is using a head pointer might find it quite difficult to actually press tiny little buttons. So from my experience at the gym, to join their Wi-Fi, you have to press the smallest button in the world. So if you imagine someone that maybe has a tremor or whatever it may be, and they struggle to press those buttons, it can just almost be a complete blocker for those user groups. So it's just important to kind of keep a few of those things in mind. And the last wee thing on just sort of things to keep in mind for mobility impairments is basically how they operate or navigate using the page, so or using the keyboard, excuse me. So we've got an example from the Velux website. So all these little, you can see these little circles here. So basically, keyboard navigation should move from the left to right, top to bottom in English. So it should follow the natural reading order of the page and should only go to elements that are actually visible on the page. So on this, on the Velux website, unfortunately, focus moves into an expandable menu while it isn't expanded. So if you imagine you're a sighted keyboard user and you're trying to navigate the page and you don't know where the focus indicator is, you don't know what element you're interacting with, it just becomes almost impossible to actually use the page. So we always encourage clients that we work with to always make sure that they're using HTML to specification. So as I mentioned, using buttons and links instead of using just divs everywhere, spans, all these kind of things, and just make sure that the page is just fully keyboard operable. And the next thing is implementing a skip to content link. So over here, we've got an example of the skip to content link on the gov.uk website. So basically, it's a link that when keyboard, it's not visible until a keyboard user navigates to it, and then they can press enter, and it skips all the repeated content on the page, because it can become quite a lot if you're tabbing through the site every time. You have to go through the navigation bar and all the subsequent information there. And the next thing, we've got an example from the W3C website on a focus indicator. So this yellow with the black outline is just to show where focus is on the page. And as I mentioned before, it's just about making sure that focus indicator is clear and stands out to all users, even if they're someone with some form of visual impairment. And also make sure that, just for voice, just to make sure that the screen's voice operable as well. So that can be by making sure that links and buttons don't just, you've not just got several find out more links on a page. Please never do that, because it's a bit of a mess. Just maybe adding a bit more detail into buttons as well. So maybe find out more about accessibility or whatever it may be, just to make sure that it's just the purpose of these buttons is clear to all users. And the last little or the last user group that I'm going to discuss today is just on cognitive impairments. So people with cognitive or learning disabilities may rely on text readers, voice recognition, custom text spacing. So I'm going to show you a wee example of that on the next page. But basically, custom text spacing is a way for users to actually increase the space between text and words and everything like that. It makes it easier for a lot of user groups, such as those with dyslexia. They actually really benefit from it. And it's also, as I mentioned before, it's really important to make sure that video content, it's possible to stop it, pause it, turn the volume down, whatever it may be, as it can be quite distracting for all users, but in particular, maybe those with ADHD or whatever it may be, that might actually be distracted by the content and then end up getting frustrated and maybe forgetting what they're on that page to do. So it's just important to make sure you do that as well. And the last thing is just make sure, as I've said, just make sure content is written in plain English, and then you can supplement it with images and other media as well, as long as that media is also accessible. So here's an example of the text spacing bookmarklet, and the text spacing bookmarklet is in the resources at the end, if you are interested in having a wee look at that as well. So on the left here, we've got the BBC page without text spacing applied, and on the right, we've got it with text spacing applied. So it basically just adds a lot more of spaces in between letters and words and everything like that. It just makes it a lot easier for all users to actually interact with the site, and especially those, as I say, with maybe dyslexia and whatever it may be. So the last thing I'm just going to kind of talk about today is just mobile accessibility, because mobile accessibility is actually very different from kind of web apps and websites and things like that. So you've actually got accessibility built into your phone. I don't know how many of you have ever looked at it, but you've got voiceover on iPhones and talkback on Android devices. So I would really encourage you to learn more about this and maybe give it a go. But I would encourage you to watch a video to maybe see how you use it and turn it off first, as it can be quite a lot. So basically, what a mobile screen reader you will do, instead of interacting by just kind of clicking on elements, they will go through the page by using swipe gestures, and then it will move to different elements on the page and read them all out in succession. And there's also different ways to navigate as well. But if you wanted to give it a go, I would encourage you to just have a wee go and just swipe through maybe a different website and see how accessible maybe your own websites are, or maybe your own company's websites are, or whatever it may be. And there's also loads of other different accessibility features, such as Zoom as well on mobile devices as well. So the one way to make sure that you're developing accessible mobile devices is by having a look at the BBC Mobile Accessibility Guidelines. So a link to this is also in the resources at the end. But here we've got just a screenshot of the main page. So basically,
I think push on the slide, Kieran. Sorry.
I'll need to figure out how to do this. But yeah, sorry about that. So on this page we've got just a wee screenshot of that, and basically it's a way for to help guide, or gives guidelines for native apps and web apps, and basically it gives comprehensive coverage and addresses a wide range of mobile accessibility issues, including the ones I've mentioned, so visual, auditory, motor, and cognitive impairments. And it's really good as well, because if you're quite new to accessibility, you can have a wee read through it, and it also gives you kind of practical examples on how you can design things accessibly. And it also goes above and beyond the WCAG guidelines that I mentioned. So it doesn't just meet AA, it also tries to have full best practice for mobile accessibility. And it's also regularly updated as well. So it's just, it tries to evolve with the different accessibility needs as over time. So that's basically me. So just one last wee point is just as so I've got an image here of Boromir from Lord of the Rings that says, "One does not simply ignore accessibility." So the main point that I want you to take away from today is that, as Anita mentioned, if you make sure that accessibility is embedded into all stages of development, from design to the development to the testing, you can try and make your product as accessible as possible, and just make sure that it reaches the widest possible audience as well, and just make sure that everyone's able to do it and or to interact with it. And I would also encourage you as well just to have a wee go at tabbing through maybe your favorite websites that you go to every day, and just press the tab key and see what their focus indicators look like, and if the focus moves the right way. So that's yeah. So at the end here, I've also got a big list of resources that I will be sending out after this, because I've actually added some. But yeah, if you've got any questions, you can fire away. You can also send me a wee email at kieran@uservision.co.uk if you want to have a wee chat. I'm also on LinkedIn. I'm on Slack. I'm in the Scottish Tech Army Disability Inclusion Slack channel as well. So yeah, if you don't want to ask any questions now, or think of some tomorrow, well, maybe not tomorrow because I won't be looking at my email tomorrow, but on Monday, if you've got any questions or just want to discuss accessibility, be happy to do so. So, and also thank you to Anita for helping me out today, and Joe. Thank you very much.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much, Kieran. Really appreciate that. Big round of applause to you. I'll just stop the recording now if anyone would like to ask any questions.